Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and in this video we're going to talk about the design and the performance differences between the older whitewater kayaks of the early 1970s and the early 1980s and this very similarly proportioned but very different shaped modern river touring design that I've been working on right here. Now, this video was actually originally the center section of the much larger video where I talk about this design in general, but I realized that that was going to make that video way too long. So I broke this out into its own separate chunk. We're going to talk a lot about hull shaping, a lot about kayak history, and my experiences using this boat on the water versus those earlier boats that I was just talking about. So if you want to learn about the whole evolution of this project, a really detailed tour of the boat, and also where this design is headed from here, make sure you check out that video. In this video, we're just going to focus in on hull design. So let's start out with this kayak here. What you're looking at is a kayak that's 13 feet long by 24 inches wide. It's got a fairly full symmetrical shape on the deck here. It's got a long continuous rocker and it's got a fairly straight sheer. And this would be the slalom kayaks of the early 1970s, the whitewater kayaks of the early 1980s. If you shrunk it down by a couple feet, now you're looking at the whitewater kayaks of the early 1990s. And then if you skip forward a couple decades, make it a little bit wider, give it a little bit better hull shape, put a hatch on the back and maybe a skeg in the back, and now you're looking at the crossover kayaks that you see today. Now, the advantage of this basic hull concept is that it's very quick, it's very maneuverable, and it's very stable. Now, it's stable because it doesn't have a lot of volume in the ends, and it also has a fairly wide plan form here, which lets you sit the boat really down onto its line, so it gives you a good feeling of stability. It's quick because it's a short boat with a fairly rounded hull, and it's very maneuverable because the kayaker sits right at the pivot point right here, which gives you ideal access to all four quadrants for your maneuvering strokes. Now, the advantage of the earliest versions of these that were 13 to 14 feet long was that they had a lot of room for camping gear. So you could really load them down and take them on long river trips, although they had the disadvantage of the fact that the only good place to put that gear was right behind the paddler. Now, this is good because it concentrates the inertia towards the center of the boat, which means that it's going to be the most responsive to maneuvering strokes, but it's bad because this kind of a boat with the paddler already sitting forward always has a tendency to veer off really quickly whenever you stop paddling. And if you have that kind of bulldozer of inertia behind you pushing on you, it would have the tendency to spin you 180 degrees, at which point it would start tracking straight in the direction that you were trying to go, but you would be facing backwards and you'd have to turn the boat around and get back on line. Now, I think just as a general balance of paddling characteristics, these boats were pretty ideal for the job that they were trying to do at the time, which was everything, because there wasn't the same degree of kayak specialization that we see today. Now, the other disadvantage, I guess, that you could say is that because of the weight of the paddler forward in this boat and the fairly low volume ends, is that they did have a fairly significant pin potential, the possibility of coming over a rapid and getting stuck on a rock and potentially getting trapped in the kayak. And you know, some people drowned in those episodes, although they were not very frequent, and that does still happen even in the modern kayaks of today. So that's kind of what kayaks were in the past. Now let's just jump up to the boat that I'm working on right now and talk a little bit about how it's different, some of the advantages, and some of the disadvantages. So I want to start off by saying that this drawing is not intended to be accurate. I was having some issues with the flexibility of the battens I was drawing with right here. So the actual kayak is much fuller towards the ends than what you're seeing right here, both in the plan view and in the profile view. Now, what you're looking at here, at least in the overall proportions, is not a lot different than the early slalom kayaks. It's about 13.5 feet long. It's around 24 inches wide. It's very full on the deck, although it's more of a Swede form deck, which means the wider point is further aft right here. And also the cockpit position is further aft to keep the overall hull balance. Now, in the profile view here, you can see that this isn't a continuous rocker, it's actually a progressive rocker. It's very flat through the center section here, and then it gets progressively steeper and steeper as you get towards the ends, even much steeper in the actual version of this. And this, combined with the curved shear line, brings the volume of the kayak more towards the ends, and also it brings a lot more volume above the water line in the ends, which can be really advantageous, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Now, at least in a sea kayaking context, the overall advantages of this sort of a hull concept is that it's very naturally balanced in the wind and the waves without a skeg or without a rudder. Also, can be a little bit more efficient of a hull, so you pick up a little bit of quickness. And then, of course, that higher volume bow here with the paddler sitting further back means that it's going to pop up easier over big foam piles when you're heading out through the surf, or if you bring this into a whitewater context, when you're plowing down onto a hull. Now, in a whitewater context where you've got a boat that doesn't have the steep ends like a sea kayak that are responsible for the tracking, this kind of a shape is actually really helpful because the wider, flatter section of the hull in the back here combined with more of a rounded section of the hull in the front creates a boat that drags a little more by the stern. And the reason that's useful is because it acts like the fletches on an arrow, which gives you a little more natural directional stability than you would have otherwise. And you see a lot of this shaping creeping into a lot of the modern river running kayaks. You can definitely see a big difference in the creek boat designs that have evolved over the last 10 years or so. Now, this kind of a shaping is especially advantageous in a river touring context because it's going to be faster and it's going to be more directionally stable, which means it's going to paddle a lot better in the flat water and the swift water sections, which is most of what you're doing on a wilderness river trip. Now, additionally, the paddler being located further back and the overall hull balance of this means that it's not going to veer off quite as quickly when you stop paddling, and that combined with splitting the gear between the front and the back kind of reduces what I was talking about earlier when you pack all the gear behind you and the inertia of it tends to push you offline and spin you in circles really quickly. Now, there's upsides and there's downsides to this. So I'll just mention the last upside here, which is this high volume bow doesn't tend to plunge as deeply into aerated water, which helps to reduce one of the bigger dangers of running longer boats in whitewater, which is pin potential. Also, it just helps you to get over obstacles because even though I've had plenty of fantasies when I was coming up on a big hull, I was just going to get down really low and take a stroke and go under the hull and pop out the backside. In reality, that usually just ends up with you getting severely pounded. I've had way better luck by pulling the bow up and then at the last moment doing a delayed boof and just climbing through the foam pile and getting up over that than trying to get under it. So, for my personal opinion, I would always rather have a lifting, higher volume bow and just accept the increased risk of getting back-endered than a lower volume bow and deal with the more risk, I think, of getting pounded. Now, the disadvantages to this kind of a shape is that with the boater sitting further back like this, and also there being gear loaded more towards at least the front end of it right here, when you go to activate what I think is your prime weapon in maneuvering in whitewater, which is your bow draw stroke, it's not nearly as responsive. You know, what I like to feel in a whitewater kayak is when I'm maneuvering through a rapid, all of a sudden I need to make a directional change. Usually that's happening with bow strokes because rudder strokes are slowing you down, and it's never a good idea to lose your momentum in whitewater unless you're trying to back paddle to get around an obstacle. And so having this on the river a couple times now, taking it through some mixed class 1, 2, and 3 water, I definitely felt that the responsiveness to my bow stroke was lacking, and that wasn't my favorite thing. But you really just have to ask yourself if the advantages that you're gaining in a particular boat concept are worth the disadvantages that you're losing, and that honestly might depend on the overall situation that you're planning to use that boat in. All right, so that's what I have to say about this particular hull design for right now. I'm really excited to see where this goes once we get more prototypes built and get some more on the water testing, and of course I'll make videos about that as well. Now, like I said in the beginning, this is just a small portion of what was a much longer video where I talk about the evolution of this design project. I give you guys a really detailed tour of the boat, and I also go into detail answering a bunch of the questions that people have sent in about performance, durability, construction, longevity, just all sorts of interesting stuff. So make sure you check out that video as well. For now, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You can also find us at capefalconkayaks.com where we've got a bunch more skin-on frame building videos. You can find us on Instagram at capefalconbuilds where I post a daily build blog of everything I'm doing here in the shop, including time-lapse videos. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Have fun building your skin boat and be safe on the water.